Hi, everybody. My name is Taylor Spaziani, and I'm here for the Sexual Health Alliance. Today, I'm here with Spencer. Thank you so much, Spencer, for being here with us today. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So to get started, I just kind of wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit about yourself, kind of include your pronouns and how you identify, and whatever you want to include that you feel is important.
Okay. Spencer, he, him, his. And I am, in many ways, your sort of typical suburban middle-aged dad. I have a 15-year-old daughter. I live in the burbs. But despite that, I have some rather particular knowledge around trans issues. I transitioned from female to male 25 years ago. And prior to that, identified as being queer. And so basically my entire adult life has been largely centered around doing activism around LGBTQ issues. I practiced law for 28 years. My law practice really had very little to do with LGBTQ activism, other than working with folks specifically around adoption issues, surrogacy agreements, estate planning, which sometimes can have some elements that are very specific to one's sexual orientation or gender identity. But my advocacy work outside of practice has largely been centered around trans issues for the last 25 years. And currently what I do for work is I do consulting work for businesses, both profit and nonprofit, around trans inclusion and diversity. So, and sometimes that can mean talking to companies about what kinds of policies they should be instituting and how they should be handling things. And sometimes it involves direct trainings for everybody from the executive level down to frontline workers.
Oh, awesome. Thank you so much for your advocacy, Spencer. Appreciate the work. Well, before I ask you some more questions about these issues, I kind of wanted to get to know Spencer a little bit better.
Mm-hmm.
So would you want to tell us maybe some of your 3 bucket list items?
Oh gosh, bucket list items. One of them would be traveling to Antarctica. Largely because it was one of my dad's bucket list items that he never got to do before he died. Yeah. A second bucket list item is really being able to take my daughter and my partner to Sweden, which is where I was born, and where most of my family still is. I haven't been back in 20 years, I think. Maybe longer. Oh gosh, I guess longer. 26 years since the last time I was back. So I'd like to be able to take them and for them to see and experience more of my history, my heritage, and my family. And a third bucket list item. I'm pretty content with the life I've had. I don't really have a lot of bucket list items left. So
totally, those sound really special too. So thank you for sharing. Do you have a specific gender or sexuality role model that you look up to?
I can't say that I have one in particular. I have quite a few folks that I've met over the years, and I'm very fortunate that I get to call a lot of folks that people know pretty well or may know of. I count them amongst my friends. So, but folks that I can think of in particular that have had significant impacts on me are people like Tony DeBlas, who unfortunately died a number of years ago. I think a lot about people who unwittingly may have had an impact on me, like Renee Richards, who was the first trans person that I ever became aware of
Mm.
when I was, what, 11, 12, 13 years old. Was right about the time that Renee was fighting to be able to play tennis on the women's tennis tour.
Mm.
And I was an avid tennis player at the time. So, and was a big fan of folks like Billie Jean King and Martina Navratilova. And although neither of them were out at that time, um, it's one of those, if you know, you know.
Right.
Um, and so certainly felt some kinship with them as a young queer person. Um, and then really my role models tend to be in the sort of the influencers in my life have tended maybe not to necessarily be LGBTQ in any way. Um, but I just think about people that have had significant impacts on the way that my worldview is shaped. So growing up as a kid in the 60s and 70s, you can't help but have your worldview be shaped by people like Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, um,
Hmm.
Shirley Chisholm, Gloria Steinem, um, Billie Jean King's fight around Title IX issues for uh, young women athletes. Those were all things that really, and growing up during the Vietnam War. So, I mean, I grew up during the Vietnam War, civil rights movement, women's rights movement, and the beginnings of the LGBTQ movement. Those are sort of the bigger things that shaped how my worldview is. So it's not necessarily about one particular person or even a couple of particular people, but rather the culmination of those big social forces all coming together and really shaping the way that I viewed the world.
Oh, cool. Thank you so much. The list goes on and on of all the powerful people, right?
It does.
Thanks for sharing. In your life, every day, what would you say are some of the most important values that you live up to?
I think some of the more important ones for me are around integrity.
Mm.
Um,
Hmm.
do what you say and mean what you say.
Right.
Um, Responsibility. And by that, I mean not only being a responsible person for yourself, but also for the people around you.
Of course.
Um, I think one of the things that's being interesting to me during this whole pandemic is I see people taking more responsibility for each other
Mm. Hmm.
than before the great pause.
Right.
So I see more people stepping outside their comfort zone and saying, no, I'm responsible not only for myself, but for my neighbors or for my coworkers. And so I have to do things that indicate that, whether that's staying home, whether that's uh, helping make sure that an elderly neighbor has the things that they need. Um, there's lots of ways for people to sort of step outside their little insular
Hmm.
cocoon, which I think we've all gotten pretty used to doing. We live in a society, particularly here in the US, where people are very insular. And so it's been heartwarming to see people, again, taking responsibility for the larger community, not just for themselves.
Absolutely. I cannot agree more with you. Human connection is beautiful right now.
It is, despite the distance.
Exactly. Yeah. I totally agree. So, as a trans individual, Spencer, what are some ways that people might have tried to be an ally to you, but may have missed the mark in doing so?
Honestly, I'll tell you, I think the biggest way that it's happened to me and really everyone else that I know
Hmm.
is people either directly or inadvertently outing me.
Mm.
So they'll say things like, "Oh, well, this is Spencer. He's trans." And it's really not so much about them being an ally to me, about giving themselves a cookie
Right.
for having this exotic creature in their life, basically.
Mm,
So, it's very self-serving for the person that's doing it. It does nothing for me as an ally. So, what I tend to tell people when I do trainings is my story is my story. I get to tell it just like you get to tell your stories. So for example, um, I kind of use the notion of uh, you wouldn't say to somebody when you first meet somebody and you're introducing someone, oh, this is Bob, my friend with cancer,
right.
right?
Exactly.
You tell somebody something else about Bob that was interesting, because being trans is not the singular most interesting thing about me. It's probably the least interesting thing about me. But yet people lead with that. And I think they do that in a way to try to indicate that they're an ally. They try to indicate how cool they are,
Mm,
how accepting they are. And it really falls flat,
I
because then the conversation becomes not about getting to know me, but about wanting to be educated about trans people. And it's like, that's what I do for a living, folks. So if you'd like to hand me some money, I'll be happy to do that for you. But I think that there's this expectation that's placed on trans people to
mm,
be educators
mm,
about what being trans is. And oftentimes, trans people are not the best people to do that.
mm,
Just because you are trans doesn't mean that you know all the ins and outs of uh, medical treatments or legal issues, or even social issues that involve trans people. Let people who are educators do that educating.
That's very insightful, Spencer. Thank you so much. And I can imagine how exhausting it is to have to educate someone when, that's just who you are. I don't know why
Yeah.
it has to be everyone's job to educate when.
Well, and I think to some extent it's a function of it being uh, sort of a newer topic for people.
Hmm.
I think if we look at lesbians and gay men and bisexual folks, we have much more representation in the media.
Hmm.
We have much more that's been written about, and depending on where we live, we have a lot more people that are just living their lives outly. And so as a society, people have more information, or they think they have more information about what it means to be LGBT.
Right.
They have less information about what it means to be trans. And when you look at the ways in which media talks about trans people or portrays trans people, um, well, number one, trans men just don't seem to exist at all.
Mm,
If you just look at media, because they only focus on trans women,
mm. Interesting.
which I think has elements of um, both exotifying and eroticizing trans women for
Absolutely.
public consumption. And since the vast majority of media is done via the male gaze, I think that tells you a lot about what cisgendered men in media are interested in.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um, and but it's also, I think, an element of kind of a reverse misogyny, if you will, in that if we are born female or identified as male at birth, or I'm sorry, as female at birth, if we're identified as female at birth, then we simply remain female for all intents and purposes for the rest of our lives. And therefore, our voices are not important.
Mm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. How would you
So, and
refer
because
to
for many of us, testosterone being as powerful a hormone as it is, we have the ability to walk through the world invisibly
Hmm, wow.
in many ways. And sometimes we're invisible to each other.
Yeah.
I've certainly been to conferences that are largely targeted at trans men and have had other trans men say to me, "Are you one of the doctors who's here to present, or are you somebody's parent?" I'm like, "I'm a parent, but I'm also a trans man." And sometimes I get sort of like a shocked response from them,
Mm.
um, especially the newer they are to their own process of transition. So that invisibility, and I use invisibility rather than saying stealth or passing. Those are terms I don't particularly care for.
Right.
I'm neither stealth nor passing. I mean, if you Google me, it becomes very apparent quickly that I'm trans. But as I move through the world, I'm invisible.
Mm.
I'm just another middle-aged white guy in the suburbs,
Right.
you know. Yet for some trans women, that experience is very different.
Mm.
My beard is doing some very strange thing over here. There we go.
That's very insightful. Thank you so much, Spencer, for
Mhm.
letting us in on that perspective. I think that's a game changer for a lot of people who don't recognize this kind of invisibility that trans men do walk with. So thank you for
Well, and that plays over into lots of things, right? So when we talk about, if we talk about all of the current proposed legislation in many places around preventing trans youth from participating in athletics,
Mhm.
the entire focus of that is on trans girls
Mm.
somehow having some advantage over other girls.
Right.
Trans boys are never even talked about.
So true.
When have you seen a story, either on the news or read in an article, that has ever mentioned trans boys?
Yeah, that's so true and shocking because I don't think about that either
Right,
regularly until you think
right.
about
And
it.
yet, trans boys also participate in sports.
Right. So interesting. Hmm. Well, I guess to speak on the contrary of that, what would you
Mhm.
say has been a time that somebody may have provided an unexpected allyship to you that you had not thought about before it happened?
I can't say that there's anything that's been particularly unexpected. Um, I think what I find has been more unexpected is uh, organizations or companies that are proactively trying to do something different, and to acknowledge the fact that trans people exist and how can they best serve trans people within their particular, um, either client base or their employees or whatever group of people they serve. So, um, and some of those organizations have done that work for a lot longer than others. And so I think more so for me, it's those organizations that were ahead of the curve
Mm.
that, were sometimes a little bit surprising that they were the ones coming and asking for assistance. Number of years ago, I did uh, a series of work with the Washington Interscholastic Athletic Association, which governs interscholastic sports, but also any other after school program. So, chess club or debate or any of those things are governed by that body. And they had asked for assistance from a group of trans advocacy folks. And so, myself and some other folks sat down with them and hammered out a policy to allow trans youth to participate. And that was probably 10, I'm thinking 10, 15 years ago at this point.
Well,
Um, so way ahead of the curve of where the rest of the country has been around that issue. And, what we also get to see from that is that trans youth have been participating, at least here in Washington State, without any difficulty or huge controversy for that period of time.
right.
So it gives other folks the opportunity to use that. to combat these proposed legislations that we're seeing now that would prevent trans youth from participating rather than encouraging them to participate.
Absolutely. That's so powerful. Uh, can you maybe talk a little bit about how people can be an ally to trans or non-binary or gender diverse individuals?
I think there's a lot of ways that people can be good allies.
Yeah,
One of the easiest ways is to let people know what your pronouns are.
right.
And it's not about preferred pronouns. And let's be clear about that. Nobody has preferred pronouns. People just have pronouns that they use. Saying preference implies that then the user can choose what works better for them rather than using what's appropriate for the individual that's
Mhm.
expressed their pronouns. So, and I think in this day and age, largely when we're doing so much work online via email or via these kinds of meetings, um, if you're not actually seeing somebody face to face, their name may or may not give you any indication of what pronouns they might use. And so, being able to use that in your email signature, I think, is a really great way of creating better communication between folks,
Totally.
so that you're not inadvertently misgendering somebody. So that's one good way to do it. Another good way to do it is if your company doesn't have, or your some organization that you belong to, or even your gym or wherever it is that you congregate doesn't have policies and procedures around trans inclusion and trans diversity,
Hmm.
go to whoever you need to go to request that.
Right.
That's a great way to be an advocate without having to advocate for one individual,
Absolutely.
or even to indicate why you're wanting to advocate for.
Right.
You can simply say, I think our company would do well to do this.
I love it.
If we're here to attract the best and the brightest, then let's make sure that people feel welcome to be
Absolutely.
here. If there is legislation that's being proposed in your city, county, state, go and lobby. Send letters, send emails, make phone calls to whoever is your representative for that particular level of government. That's a great way to be an advocate. Certainly, I think we saw in South Dakota, for example, that was a very effective tool at getting the governor to not sign the legislation that had been proposed.
Hmm.
It didn't work so well in Idaho. But politicians have to pay attention to what their constituents have to say.
Right.
I'll never forget a story. There's a trans woman that I know back east who lived in Pennsylvania. And she lived in a very conservative district. And this is probably 20 years ago at this time. But she made an effort to get to know who her state representative was in Congress. And so she would, whenever he was in town, she would go to his office and sit down and chat with him about what was important to her. And over time, they got to be friends. And the thing about that is, when you know someone, it's really hard to vote to discriminate against them.
Right.
So, regardless of the fact that that particular politician was a Republican and a conservative, that politician consistently voted in favor of any LGBTQ rights because of his connection with one constituent.
The power. The power.
And I think that's something that we've seen sort of consistently if we look at sort of broader LGBTQ political movement.
Right.
If I think back to when I was much younger, and we had a variety of propositions being brought both in Oregon and Washington that were very anti-LGBT. Um, One of the things that we did was go door to door and engage people in a conversation.
Hmm.
If people get to know someone and know that somebody is their neighbor, their coworker, their gym buddy, their fellow congregant in their church. If they get to know you, it's much harder to say, yeah, I think that rights should be taken away from you, or that you should be prevented from having something, that you don't deserve to be an equal citizen.
Right.
So the more that you can make things personal, sort of the better in the long run. And where cisgendered and other, cisgender, regardless of their sexual orientation, where cisgender folks can become good advocates and allies for trans people, is about taking that step and saying, look, let's have a better and more inclusive policy of work here.
Absolutely. The personal is political, right?
Right. You know, and then just like with any other kind of ism, if you see somebody or hear somebody telling a joke that isn't funny, that is derogatory, call
Mhm.
them on it.
Absolutely. I
You
I
know,
as well.
if you wouldn't put up with a racist joke in the workplace, you shouldn't put up with a trans joke in the workplace.
Yeah, it's so
If you
so
wouldn't put up with a sexist joke in the workplace, don't put up with a trans joke in the workplace.
that is so
Now,
important.
I'm not an idiot. I know that those kinds of jokes happen in workplaces all over every day. But if you want to be an effective ally at a time when nobody's there to pat you on the back for doing it, that's
Mhm.
a great way to do it. Be
Integrity,
the person who's willing to say, you know what, that's not funny.
right,
That's derogatory. That doesn't belong here.
right. And that goes back to your values, integrity, like you mentioned at
Exactly.
the beginning.
Yeah.
So true, and it's
And
so important.
responsibility, taking care of other people.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much, Spencer. I appreciate you sharing your stories and your insight and your perspective. It's been awesome. Before we
My
end, I
pleasure.
kind of wanted to roll the red carpet out for you and give you an opportunity to tell the world what you're working on, share anything you're passionate about, and anything that you'd like anybody to know.
Well, the things that I'm working on are the things that I'm always working on, which are trying to encourage companies to do a better job around trans inclusion, and to make sure that their employees have at least a baseline training.
Right.
Um, and, one of the things that I love about that work is you never know whose life you're going to touch and in what way. And so that's what keeps me passionate about it. I did a training for a company about a year and a half ago, and there was a gentleman in the training who I wasn't entirely sure that he was really getting what was going on, or it just his vibe seemed sort of pulled back a little bit.
Hmm.
And then towards the end of that training session, he raised his hand and said, quite unexpectedly for me, he's like, so my child just came out to me as being non-binary, and I'm really struggling with pronoun use. And so here's this opportunity for this guy who's been keeping this really close, to be able to tell his coworkers about something real about him.
Mm.
The topic was something that touched him in his life directly. Um, and he got to get some support and comfort and relief out of that training session. Now, chances are nobody in his company would have known that this was an issue that was personal to him in his life, and that this training came at a really good time.
Mm.
So it's those kinds of things that keep me really passionate about doing this work, because you never know what ripple that stone that you first throw into the pond is going to touch, and the ripples keep going.
Right.
So it's like the training affected him, therefore affected his family, his child, the other members of his family, and then beyond that, who knows?
Totally. That's beautiful.
So um, that is the stuff that I remain really passionate about.
Thank you, Spencer. That was beautiful. I appreciate it again so much for taking the time to do this today.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure. Have a good rest of your day. Thank you.
Yeah, you too. Bye bye.